Hi, I was recently asked to make a video that focuses on the parity and memorization involved with using M2 edges in combination with OP corners. I will, however, only spend the last couple of minutes of this video talking about memorization because I decided to give a much more thorough discussion in another tutorial that focuses only on memory methods. So see the description for that tutorial. If you haven't already gathered, this video assumes that you already know how to independently use M2 edges and old Pochmann corners. For those that do already know how to use M2 edges and OP separately, this tutorial aims to give you some assistance with implementing the two methods into the one solve. How you deal with parity is ultimately determined by whether you execute the corners or edges first. In regards to choosing your execution order, I don't recommend that you choose the order based on which parity fix you prefer. Instead, you should decide whether you execute corners or edges first based on whichever order suits your memory best. This is not only because the different parity fixes take about the same time, but mainly because the memory stage is such an important part of the solve, and that should not be compromised. So for example, if you find that memorizing the corners last and then solving them first is easiest for you, then stick with it. Don't just change your preferred order because you like the parity fix for solving edges first. If you're still unsure whether to execute corners or edges first, it doesn't matter. Just try both ways and see which order you prefer, because after all, you can change the order at any time you like, so it's no big deal. I can't show you all the various ways to fix parity because there are too many, so I'm going to show you 3 different parity fixes that are my favorite. It's also worth mentioning that due to the nature of some parity fixes, you're not only forced to execute in a specific order, but also memorize in a specific order. Here's the first parity fix. This one's one of the more commonly used. Ideally, you would memorize the corners last, then execute them first. The reason why you should memorize in that certain order is because when you memorize the edges first, that lets you know whether you have parity or not, which will then enable you to memorize the corners in such a way that will make you easily be able to fix parity if it exists. So if you're going to do a solve with this parity method, the way you would go about it is memorize the edges, then you'll know if you have parity or not, and if you do have parity, once you go on to memorize the corners, you need to treat the piece that belongs at UBL as if it's the piece that belongs at UBR, and vice versa. If you do this correctly, you will memorize the corners so that once you've executed them, all the corners will be solved except UBL and UBR will be swapped, like they are now. Normally, if the buffer became solved, you would arbitrarily shoot to any unsolved piece to break into a new cycle. However, since the piece that normally belongs in the buffer is now representing UBR, you need to shoot to one of the 3 stickers of UBR so that it will be correctly oriented. That sounds more difficult than it is. If you don't want to do that, you can simply do an L-perm after you've solved the corners to swap UBL and UBR. Okay, moving on. So you then go on to execute the edges, of course, and once you've executed all the edges in the memo, you'll be left, because you have parity, you'll have the M slice off and these 2 corners will still be swapped. So what you'll do to fix this is M2, F2, U, T-perm, then undo U-perm, F2. Daniel Shepard recently posted an algo on the speed solving forums. So instead of setting up to a T-perm, you could use M2, U, wide L, R, U2, wide R prime, U prime, wide R, U2, wide L prime, U, R prime, U2. This next parity fix is, in my opinion, the most simplest. It's convenient to memorize in either order, so memorize the corners or edges first, it doesn't matter. You must, however, execute the edges first. If you're going to use this parity fix in a solve, the way you would go about it is, well, memorize the cube first, and then execute the edges. And if you've got parity, once you've finished the edges, like I've done here, the M/ will be off by an M2. And what you want to do, this is all you have to do to fix parity. D prime, L2, D, M2, D prime, L2, D. Then just solve the corners and then flip or twist any pieces that need to be dealt with. If you don't like doing the L turns on that, you could alternatively do U prime, F2, U, M2, U prime, F2, U. This parity fix requires you to memorize the edges last and then execute them first. This method of dealing with parity is unique because you don't need to go out of your way to execute a specific algorithm. So in order to use this parity fix on a solve, you'd start off by memorizing the corners, and that'll let you know whether you have parity or not. And if you do have parity, you need to do something very similar to the first parity fix I showed you where these two corners were left swapped. So what we need to do is treat UL, while we're memorizing the edges, treat the piece UL as if it's UB and the piece UB as if it's UL. And if you do that right, once you move on to execute the edges, you should solve all the edges, like I've done here, and UB, however, and UL will be left swapped. And that does a couple of things. Swapping UB and UL, it means that you can have parity without having the M/ off, and it means that you can, when you solve the corners with an odd number of Y-perms, these two edges are going to swap back, and it's going to be solved. So you really haven't done any, you haven't done any parity algorithm, except the Y-perm in itself is a parity algorithm, but you're not executing as if it is a parity algorithm. You're just doing it to solve the corners. Now, regardless of the execution or memorizing order you choose, there's something that should still be universal with memorizing. Memorize your edges in pairs. This will enable you to easily keep track of the position of the M/ while you're solving, and it'll also compress the memo and thus make it easier to recall. The tutorial I linked in the description explains how to use pairs. But first, in order to use pairs, you have to have a lettering scheme. If you don't already have one, get yourself a lettering scheme. That is, you assign each sticker position, except your buffer, a letter from the alphabet, no shit, and then your memo can be expressed as a sequence of letters. For example, for me, my lettering scheme, UL is A, UB is B, and UC is, holy crap, that's bad. UL is the letter A, UB is the letter B, and UR is the letter C. So if my targets were UL, UB, and UR, the memo could be expressed as ABC. I've linked a link to the speed solving wiki on SPEFs in the description, and that's a standardized scheme, so it'll give you a better idea of what's involved with the lettering scheme, and you could even use that one if you wanted. A lettering scheme will not only allow you to easily manage pairs, but it will give you a much wider variety of memory methods to choose from. Obviously, different memory systems will more appropriately fit one execution order or the other. For example, if you memorize the corners visually, you're most likely going to be better off to memorize them last and then solve them first, rather than the other way around. I see a lot of people ask questions like, what's the best memory method? That doesn't have an objective answer, because we all have slightly different brains, and a memory method that works well for one person might not work so well for someone else. Finding the right memory method takes time, and I encourage you to try both execution orders, both memorizing orders, and also experiment with various memory methods and different combinations of memory methods. Everyone who can do blind has the potential to memorize really fast. You just have to find the right memory system that best suits you, then practice it.